Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Thank you all for coming and making the effort in these difficult times to attend today. I would appreciate if you continue to wear your mask when possible, although of course you will need to take it off. For the speakers will not be wearing masks, and consume tea, coffee, and later a glass of wine. You're not expected to try and do that through a mask. I think I probably should run through a fire drill, but we've got the back fire door open for ventilation, and that door is going to be open for ventilation as well, so plenty of fire exits available. When we started the Bremhill Parish history, so I should introduce myself for people who don't know me. I'm Martin Nye. I've been chair of the Bremhill Parish History Group for the last 3 years. When we started the Bremhill Parish History Project in 2018 to research and share the heritage of our parish and the story of the community over the last 1,000 years, I can honestly say we didn't know what we were going to find and how the project was going to work out. We did produce a very detailed plan at the start, particularly as part of raising funds, but as we all know, no plan survives contact with an enemy, and particularly one that we hadn't anticipated. So after a great start, our programme of workshops, talks and field trips, which involved lots of you here today and many other people as well, came to a rather juddering halt in February 20. So we had to cancel many events and had to go online with the rest. But we were able to launch our trail app, which you can see, some of the displays you can see there. And we had a very well attended series of online seminars, which I think provided a useful point of social contact and engagement for many people during a difficult time. I think many of you would have seen some of the speakers we had on in the first Bremhill Parish History Festival last year, which had to be greatly reduced in scale and take place online. But I'm really delighted that we've been able to organise today's event in person. We are filming. It won't be particularly high production value film, but it'll be one that we can have on the website for people who can't make it here today, who will be able to view it. So, without further ado, on to today's programme. We've got 4 excellent speakers for you, and then we have a panel which will involve 2 of the same speakers and two other people addressing the question, what's so special about the parish of Bremhill and what's so special about this project. So we've got Simon Kerry will be speaking first about the Lansdowne family in Bremhill Parish. Simon Draper on Roman and Anglo-Saxon settlement. We'll then have a tea break. What I'd ask you to do is form an orderly queue to the back there where we'll have some tea and there's some cake. And if you can go back to your places, that'll make it. There's no space to mill, I'm afraid. David Wood will take up after the tea break with his talk on ghosts from the churchyard, and Julian Orbach will finish with notable buildings in Bremhill Parish. There'll be a short break then, and then we'll convene the panel, and then we'll have the official launch of the book, which we're very excited to be able to share with you, and you can buy that later. Great, so Simon, if you'd like to come up, we can get the proceedings started.
Hang on. Sorry guys. Right.
That was quick.
Hang on a minute, guys. There you go.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'm delighted to share with you my interest in the Lansdowne family and their Bremhill landed estate. A glance at a map shows how much of the Lansdowne estate of Bremhill has disappeared. In its heyday, in the 1880s, it was just over 4,000 acres, and today it is 80 acres. A colossal downsizing has taken place from the time of the 5th Marquess in the early 20th century to now. It does, however, still include 2 excellent village pubs, one of which is owned and managed by my nephew, and you may feel the need after my talk to visit one of them. I'd like to examine the Lansdownes and their involvement with the Bremhill Parish and start in January 1740 with John Petty. He was an Anglo-Irish politician, lawyer and High Sheriff of Kerry, keen to make himself useful in public life, not just in Ireland, but also among the British nobility. His forebears, the Fitzmaurices, originally Norman, arrived in Kerry in the 13th century, and for over 500 years they kept their lands by conquest, land acquisition, advantageous marriages, and shifting religious loyalties. John first learnt about Bremhill when he received a letter from John Bull, an aptly named land agent for various landowners in their estates at Bremhill, Bowwood and Carn, with details of a manor of some 1,800 acres lying on the River Avon at Foxham. It would be 13 years before Petty, aged 47, committed to acquiring an estate in the area. By then the property for sale was considerably larger. As with everything, luck had a part to play. Petty's maternal uncle, Henry, 1st Earl of Shelburne, died in 1751 without an heir, and his fortune passed to John. It comprised £300,000, roughly equivalent to 68 million today, a house in London and Loke's House, present-day Wickham Abbey, at High Wycombe. Power in the 18th century resided in land and politics. The Bremhill estate was an attractive purchase in 1753. The land had been neglected and provided significant potential for improvement. Never one to miss a bargain, Petty was the best bidder, paying £57,500 for the 3,778 acres. The yearly rental value of the estate was £1,976, free from encumbrances. John Bull and his son Daniel were hired to manage the estate and its tenants and properties. Within months of purchasing Bremhill, Petty declared his candidacy for Chipping Wickham at the general election and was elected a Whig MP for that borough. Simultaneously, the earldom of Shelburne in the peerage of Ireland was conferred on him, and 7 years later he was raised to the peerage of the United Kingdom as Lord Wickham. Wealth, power and status, he had it all. Petty continued to expand his land holdings whenever possible, acquiring, with the help of John Bull, Bowwood Park in 1754 and other local estates bordering Carn and Colston. He also bought the manorial rights to Bremhill and Carn, giving him and his successors controlling influence over parliamentary elections well into the 19th century. Unlike many of his aristocratic contemporaries interested solely in their rental profits, irrespective of the social harm they caused, Petty fostered a paternalistic ethos. He felt responsible very specifically for the welfare of his tenants and communities associated with his land. His investment was for the long term. Such permanent investment was profitable to both Petty and his tenants. By 1761, when Petty died and the estate passed to his son William, the estate comprised 3,816 acres with approximately 170 tenants and a total rental of £3,555, 14 shillings and 0 pence. William Petty was 24 when he took over the Bremhill estate. He was born in Dublin and raised in the remotest parts of Southern Ireland. Entering Oxford in 1755, he had both everything to learn and unlearn. Coming of age at the start of the British Industrial Revolution, he witnessed the transformation of the character and importance of Britain's rural estates. A rapidly expanding population and developing urbanisation increased demand for agricultural produce. Trends towards consolidation ran rife, and the sale of estates often accompanied the buying of others. Though wealthy, Petty spent greatly in excess of his income, something of a family trait. Having served in the army and as aide-de-camp to George III, his prospects were transformed. In 1760, with his father having been given a British peerage and moving to the House of Lords, Petty succeeded to the parliamentary seat at Wickham. At the general election of 1761, he was returned to that seat as a Whig and to the Dublin Parliament for County Kerry. With an impeccable CV, he soon rose through the ranks politically, becoming in March 1782 Prime Minister. He directed the peace negotiations with the American commissioners that resulted in the controversial 1783 Treaty of Paris, ending the War of the American Revolution. Parliament disapproved of the treaty's terms, and in March 1783, Shelburne, as he was then called, resigned. The following year he was raised in the peerage as a marquess. He chose the name Lansdowne because his first wife owned an estate centred on Lansdowne Hill in Bath. The first Marquess was not a popular minister, a fairly common and occupational hazard even today. Nevertheless, he appears to have been liked by his tenants. So what did the Bremhill estate mean to him? It was the most important and profitable agricultural part of his Wiltshire estates. Finding the right tenants and managing them so they practiced good husbandry was central to his mission. Critical to this strategy was having access to markets. Fortunately, Lansdowne was mad about road building, as was of course almost every other peer with a substantial landed estate. It was particularly intense at Bowood and Bremhill, as those estates lay along 7 miles of road connecting London to Bath and Bristol. Good roads, enhanced bridges and the like became symbols of both power and status. By the end of the 18th century, the Great Bath Road was the finest road in England. Investing in highway infrastructure was costly, as was the Marquess's gambling habits. By the mid-1780s, he owed a lot of creditors. In 1786, he sold 160 acres of his Bremhill estate, and 2 years later negotiated a deal with the Equitable Assurance Company, granting them mortgages on the Bremhill and Lokes estates in return for £60,000. Whatever he tried to do displeased his eldest son. Father and son had 2 very different views of the patrimony. The Marquess thought he was improving it by consolidating estates and selling off outlying or wholly disconnected properties. Lord Wickham thought his father was selling off land that could, in his own hands, one day become profitable. Both men were correct. By 1790, there were 13 farms in the parish. Some of these properties were further consolidated and their names changed during the 19th century. Excellent records were kept by the then agent. This slide shows a map of Chalcott Farm in 1790, and this one, the rents payable. When Lansdowne died in 1805, he left his son in a financial mess. The second Marquess was extremely able and politically astute. He was MP for Wickham for 16 years. However, he thoroughly disagreed with his father on most things and spent little time at Bowood. He preferred the sea air at Southampton Castle, where he lived. Settling his father's debts, he was forced to sell the entire Lansdowne collection of paintings, some portions of land at Bremhill, and other outlying parts, now referred to as the Bowood estate. Fortuitously for Bowood, he did not live long, dying 4 years after his father. The estates passed to his half-brother, Henry Petty. Aged 29 when he came into his inheritance, the third Marquess had already established himself as a formidable Whig politician. In 1806, he had served as the youngest ever Chancellor of the Exchequer. In a political career spanning over 60 years, he served in 8 ministries with further cabinet posts, including Home Secretary, Lord President of the Council, and Leader of the House of Lords. Like his father, he was a moderate Whig with strong natural judgment. He also was devoted to Bowood, which was nearly derelict when he took it on. As luck would have it, in 1818 he inherited a considerable fortune from his Irish cousin who had died childless, and was able to undertake a massive refurbishment programme. He bought back a large collection of paintings, watercolours and drawings that had been sold by his half-brother. He also bought back and improved properties at Bremhill, including Bremhill Grove, Manor, Nash House, Hazeland, Monument and Bremhill Wick Farms. This image shows a survey of 1847. During his stewardship, considerable efforts were taken in reorganising the estate, implementing improvements and increasing efficiency. This was largely the work of the land agent. This role had become more professional and the task much more complex. At Bremhill, the land agent communicated directly with the third Marquess by frequent letters, advising, accounting, and having a detailed knowledge of the properties and the tenants. Preserving the long-term profitability, estate management decisions were as reliant on the tenantry as they were on the economy. How the landlord-tenant economy operated was central in dictating changes in rural society. In the 1830s, 61 farmers were listed in the Bremhill Parish. This included 8 women who farmed a total of 750 acres and employed 26 labourers. In selecting the right tenants, the landlord and his agent looked for their ability to pay the rent and work the land, not really very different from today. In extreme cases where rents were not paid on time, tenants were not automatically evicted. The third Marquess had learnt from his Irish estates it was better to maintain a stable community. Rent levels were both reflective of the landlord's improvements and the wider economy. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, after a period of high rents, agricultural prices fell, despite the introduction of the Corn Laws blocking the import of cheap corn. This caused mixed farmers, and especially their labourers, such as those in Bremhill, considerable hardship. As a result of falling prices, agricultural wages fell, leading to unrest amongst labourers. Mismanagement of the Poor Laws and the long-established and widespread practice of supplementing the inadequate wages of the labouring poor out of the poor rates added to the rural crisis. 1 in 3 residents was found to be in receipt of permanent or occasional relief in the 1820s. The effects in Bremhill were less dramatic than in other parts of the country, despite incidents of theft, arson, both to property and crops, damage to trees, and poaching of game. Part of the reason the parish remained stable was due to the moderate nature of Lansdowne and to the pastoral care given by the Reverend William Lyle Bowles, the vicar of the parish from 1804 until 1845. Bowles was an amiable, absent-minded and rather eccentric man. There is very little surviving correspondence, but it is evident they were on good terms, and Bowles kept the landlord informed of local news. Bowles undoubtedly influenced Lansdowne toward making 500 acres at Carn and Bremhill parishes available to nearly 700 labourers, enabling them to grow potatoes, cabbages, wheat and barley. The tenant farmers prospered during these years. Many employed domestic staff and lived extremely well by the standards of the day. This picture shows Jacob Vines with his family and staff at Manor Farm. In the late 1830s, the opening of the Great Western Railway, which the Lansdownes were involved with, brought manufactured and other goods to and from the Bowood estates, including Bremhill. In 1855, 40 farmers were recorded out of a total of 56 commercial residents in the parish. Profits aside, the third Marquess also cared deeply about his estates for the social reputation. In 1837, he and Bowles funded the construction of a monument to Maud Heath on Wick Hill, half a mile northwest of the Bremhill village. Maud was a prosperous local lady who lived in the 15th century and bequeathed all her property to make and maintain a causeway from Wick Hill to Chippenham. Similarly, in 1838, he gave land adjoining the chapel at Foxham as a burying place for all the neighbouring hamlets. His wife, Louisa, established the church school at Foxham for 105 children. It operated initially as a Sunday and day school. Though standards were not very high, the condition of the school was satisfactory. Lady Lansdowne occasionally visited the school with friends to teach songs. Until the late 1860s, very little altered the management of the estate at Bremhill. The fourth Marquess had only a very brief 3 years at Bowood. His son was the ripe old age of 21 when he inherited in 1866. He had a definite sense of the greatest good but without any heavy Victorian worthiness. Just as it is difficult to appreciate a person like the 5th Marquess nowadays, it is difficult to understand his circumstances. The Lansdowne estates amounted to nearly 138,000 acres in Ireland, 12,000 in Wiltshire, and Lansdowne House in London, with its 4-acre garden just off Berkeley Square. Although the rental was £62,000 a year, his financial situation was not comfortable. His father had left debts of £300,000, as well as charges on some of the properties. The golden years of high agricultural prices were coming to an end and would never recover. And in the mid-1870s, an economic slump occurred and farmers' profits fell. A number of factors contributed to this: low domestic yields, increased imports from the Americas and British colonies, and from the mid-1880s, an improvement in refrigeration techniques. Labourers in Bremhill went on strike, unhappy with their wages of 17 shillings without or 15 shillings with beer. Along with this situation and the subsequent decline in rents, Lansdowne faced financial trouble from the land war in Ireland. Unwilling to pay their rents, some of his Irish tenants left him with arrears and the legal fees to reclaim them. Despite this, he commissioned a complete survey of his properties in Wiltshire and elsewhere, and over the following years approximately 300 cottages and farms were renovated. In some areas of the Beauwood estate, such as Derry Hill, he acquired further landholdings. On a number of estate properties, the dates of these alterations were carved in stone, such as at these properties in Bremhill village. His wife Maud, a daughter of the first Duke of Hamilton, was also involved in the rebuild programme, designing some of the cottages herself. Here we can see her initials in a cottage at Derry Hill. Given these challenges, he decided to accept diplomatic posts abroad, Canada and India, anywhere, rather than living in a corner of Beauwood, a fate he dreaded. While abroad, he nevertheless kept in close contact with his agents, John Spencer and Henry Herbert Smith. He kept abreast of the latest farming methods via journals and newspapers. His brother Edmund Fitzmaurice and his brother-in-law Everard Digby also got involved in the management of the estates during these years. Fitzmaurice was particularly interested in local affairs in Wiltshire. Aged 22, he was elected unopposed as Liberal MP for Cairn. In Parliament, he distinguished himself by his radicalism and strong leanings to nonconformity. He spoke up for the underpaid and unenfranchised farm labourers and threw himself into the movement for the protection of commons and open spaces and reform of local government. Serving as one of the 5 local government boundary commissioners in 1887, he became chairman of the new Wiltshire County Council. Unsurprisingly, the 5th Marquess and his brother did not always get along. The former was far more of a moderate. Fitzmaurice is best remembered in the parish for establishing free libraries with reading rooms during the 1870s and 80s at Chalcot, Foxham and Bremhill. Such was his attachment to Bremhill and its Saxon heritage that upon his death in 1935 he chose to be buried in the village cemetery next to the Saxon Tower. He is the only member of the family to date buried in Bremhill. Like his brother, the 5th Marquess also supported agriculture and the local constituencies. He served as chairman of agricultural societies in Wiltshire and Ireland and was Lord Lieutenant of Wiltshire. Local farmers apparently disliked being given a piece of his mind. He believed that a first-rate farmer should be part chemist, part meteorologist, part botanist, part zoologist, part geologist, should know a little about the mechanics of architecture, of hydrostatics, and should attend farm college. He favoured state aid to increase the number of owner-occupiers and deal with inadequate village housing. In 1888 he sold Foxham Farm with its 157 acres to the Small Farm and Labourers Land Company for £455 to be divided into small holdings. During the early years of the 20th century, land ownership was transformed. Land itself was no longer essential in furthering political or social status, nor even attractive as an economic asset. The Liberal government introduced a number of taxes on the capital value of land, including estate duty, which we know today as inheritance tax. Despite having to pay heavy taxes, he sold 1,005 acres in 1910 at Foxham, including West End, Avon, Avon Mill, Elm, Godsill, Gate and Hare Street Farms, along with pasture at Lower Caddenham. The sale raised £34,452, which in today's money is 4.1 million. In need of further cash in 1912, another tranche of 825 acres from the estate was put up for sale, including Stockham Marsh, Cider Row and Spurt Hill Farms and Enoch's Wood. These images provide some of the marketing material used to entice purchasers. Evidently, they were not enticing enough, as only Stockham Marsh sold. Raising money to maintain Bowood House and Lansdowne House, he thought the sale of peripheral land was the most effective means. Ironically, a few years later, during the First World War, agriculture experienced a period of prosperity, as farmers increased the production of food and landlords saw their rents increase. Despite this, at the end of the war, an estimated quarter of the land in Britain changed hands. Why? Well, many families had lost sons and wanted to diversify their businesses. Moreover, for most of the owners of the 90% of farmland then tenanted, rents had been anchored by the 1917 Corn Production Act, while death duties doubled in 1919. Faced with heavy taxation and the difficulty of providing a staff to cope with the requirements of a large and scattered estate, Lansdowne decided to sell a further 1,750 acres with 11 farms and 33 cottages. Again, he turned to the periphery of the estate and the land to the northeast of the Bremhill Parish at Chalcot and Spurt Hill. Sorry, seem to have gone on a bit. Learning a lesson from the wheat sales in 1912, he wrote personally to each of the tenants occupying the properties and encouraged them to purchase the ownership of their holdings. He and the then agent made sure the land was sold at public auction in lots corresponding as nearly as possible with existing tenancies. He also told his tenants he would allow the 2/3 of the purchase money, exclusive of timber, to remain on mortgage at 5% per annum for at least 3 years. The offer was too good to refuse, and 15 of the 19 lots sold. In 9 cases, the sitting tenants acquired their holdings. The sale, including timber, on the lots raised £50,580. This, in today's money, is 2.7 million. Interestingly, in the same year of the sale, he also purchased the Stanley estate, comprising 700 acres. It was closer to the core estate. During the following 25 years, the 6th and the 7th Marquesses stewarded the Bowood estate, including the remaining properties at Bremhill, on a meagre income, which never amounted to a profit. A lifeline was provided by the sale of Lansdowne House in London and many of its contents. Tragically, during the Second World War, both the 7th Marquess and his younger brother were killed. The Marquessate and the estate passed to their cousin, Major George Mercer Nye, who had inherited through his father the family's Scottish estates. Had he not felt compelled to take on Bowood, it is likely that Major Mercer Nye, who was then working at the British Embassy in Paris, would have continued with a career in diplomacy. However, he and his American wife were determined to keep Bowood going and pass it on to their eldest son. Over the following years, he put his career in politics on hold and reorganised the estate. In hindsight, it is easy to be unknowingly critical of some of the decisions he took, notably the destruction of the big house in 1955 and the many land sales. His situation, however, was far from straightforward. Neither his education nor his upbringing had equipped him with the business acumen to help him to deal with his inherited estates. Moreover, the 5th Marquess, under a Settled Land Act, had ensured that his landholdings would pass to his successors, but with restrictions on resale or profitable leasing of the land. Added to which, all of the surplus cash and the contents of Bowood House had been left to the 2 surviving daughters of the 6th Marquess. In 1947, with death duties to settle, he had to sell part of the estate. He was advised by the then land agent to sell land at Bremhill, Carn and Derry Hill. Needless to say, the timing could not have been worse, with land prices at historic lows and the introduction of the Town and Country Act. The sales were quite emotional because they meant the end of the association between the landlord and tenant, which had kept the community in good stead for 200 years. The total area comprised 1,500 acres and 9 farms with cottages including Hazeland, Bremhill Grove, Monument, Bremhill Wick, Wick Bridge, Bremhill Field, Bencroft, Charlcote and Ashhill Farms. The other lots for sale were the Dunpost Public House and accommodation land on the outskirts of Cairn. The house and buildings were all in astonishingly good condition, and the sale realised £89,530, which in today's money is 3.7 million. I asked a land agent recently what he thought such a sale would raise today, and he said 18.2 million. This figure accounts for the fact that many of the properties had leases of more than one life. Had this not been the case, it would have been much higher. One of the apocryphal stories about this sale is that some of the tenants were able to recoup the money they paid for their property from felling the timber and selling it. In the following years, the 8th Marquess made further land sales, notably on the north of the estate in Derry Hill and the south-east portion at Blacklands and Carlston. These sales coincided with the destruction of the big house and improvements to the little house, where the family now lives. The process by which the Bowwood estate contracted corresponded with a metamorphosis in the land ownership structure from the dominance of the landlord-tenant system to one of owner-occupier. Of those 90% let properties in 1900, 80% are now under some form of owner occupation. It was Lansdowne's hope that his eldest son, the Earl of Shelburne, would take over Bowwood and allow him to retire to Scotland. In preparation, Lord Shelburne, then aged 21, attended Cirencester College. After graduating, he bought Catcombe Farm at Spurt Hill and a year later land at Charlcote, where he operated a mixed farming business. Both properties, which totalled 150 acres, were once part of the Lansdowne estate. In 1965, recently married, he decided to live in the parish of Bremhill. He bought another former Lansdowne property sold in 1919 called Lower Hanger Farmhouse and the surrounding land. A year later, he also bought Hanger Park Farm, bringing his holdings to 800 acres of land formerly owned by the Lansdownes. When small country estates were being transformed by swimming pools, patios and saunas, Lord Shelburne went further, building an airstrip and hangar for his Cessna 182 airplane. He liked to keep a benevolent eye over the estate, so much so that delighted residents of Bremhill were somewhat amazed to see him taking off and landing dangerously close to the village's electric wires at the end of his runway. Wishing to avoid an accident, the local electric company installed markables on the wires. Since the Lower Farmhouse, Hanger Farmhouse seemed an unimpressive name, Lord Shelburne changed it to Bremhill House. This pomposity caused some confusion for visitors inquiring of the local inhabitants the way to the house and being advised never heard of it. Though born in London, I lived at Bremhill House until 1973. We then moved to Bowwood and my father sold the property. These were happy times and we all felt part of the community. Lord Shelburne was clerk to the Bremhill Parochial Church Council, taking on the task of mowing the churchyard. He remained on the PCC for more than 40 years. For a number of years he kept his other land holdings in the parish. Hanger Park Farm was tenanted by his first cousin and his wife. It was all going very well until their son dropped a cigarette in the barn and set the building alight. Not perhaps the best way for the estate to evolve. In the 1990s he sold this property. In subsequent years, diversification of assets resulted in the sale of the 2 remaining farmhouses, along with some land and other properties in Bremhill village, which had once formed part of the estate of the 5th Marquess. The story of the Lansdowne family and Bremhill is ongoing. The family has no political influence in the parish, but through the existing management of the Bowwood estate exerts a benign influence. My predecessors would be happy that many of their former tenants are now thriving owner-occupiers and that the parish itself is very popular with walkers and cyclists who visit and farm-based bed and breakfasts for those who stay. Thank you very much. Yes. If anyone's got a question, I'd be very happy to answer.
We've got time for a few short questions. Any questions? David.
Well, I really enjoyed that presentation, thank you. I'm going to be talking about ghosts in the churchyard, and one of those ghosts is your great uncle, Baron Fitzmaurice. Why do you think he chose to be buried in Bremhill rather than Foxton or Derry Hill or indeed Bath, where he did?
Well, as I mentioned in my talk, I believe it's because of the Saxon heritage. He was quite interested in that and wanted to be buried next to the Saxon Tower. Again, I could say more because obviously as a councillor, he did a lot for Wiltshire. His brother was buried at Derry Hill, and they didn't get along, so it would be obvious that they didn't want to be buried in the same plot, in the same churchyard. Because he wasn't the eldest member of the family, he wouldn't have gone into the mausoleum. So I think that's largely the reason. He actually lived near Bradford-on-Avon, I believe. But he was particularly fond of Bremhill. I mean, in correspondence I read in preparation of this talk, he talked about the first time he visited it. He made a lot of he spent a lot of time trying to improve this parish. And he was fond of the people who lived in it. So I think that's probably the reason.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Great, okay, well we will move on. Thank you very much indeed, Simon. Greatly appreciated. Very interesting. We're now going to stay with the Simons, and Simon Draper will pick up on one of the themes of that of Anglo-Saxon interest. Not necessarily through the prism of Fitzmaurice, but Simon, over to you. Lights.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to actually be here rather than on Zoom as I was a year ago. Last year I talked about specifically Bremhill Parish in the Anglo-Saxon period and what meagre evidence we have. There isn't a huge amount to go on. So I was encouraged to talk about something different this time. So I hope you'll forgive me for taking a step back from the parish and not talking specifically about Bremhill, but about the area that it sits in the Roman and Anglo-Saxon periods. So most of what I'm going to talk about is about North Wiltshire more generally and what was going on in the area in the sort of 600 years from 400 to sort of 1000, 1100. Okay. So starting in the Roman period, this is a map I constructed some years ago. It's a bit out of date now. I think it was about getting on for 20 years ago that I made this map, so it looks a bit dated. But you'll see that Bremhill is sort of in the middle of a square, or a triangle even, of Roman roads. We've got the A4 and the Roman road past Sandy Lane. Veluccio was the Roman name for the small town at Sandy Lane, not very far away. And then of course going to Cunetio, the Roman town of Milor, which I'll say something briefly about later. But of course we've got Bath to our west, Aquae Sulis, and we've got Cirencester to the north, Carinium Divinorum, and then we've got the Fossway going north from Bath to Cirencester. You see that there's a collection of Roman villas around. Yes, here we are. Yes, the Roman town of Veluccio has quite a sort of halo of Roman villas around it, and Headington and Headington Wick as well, and then along past Blackland, and the name Blackland is telling you that the land has been turned black. And that's usually by remains of Roman buildings and Roman occupation. Most places in the country called Blackland or Blackacre or Blackfurlong actually have Roman villas or Roman settlements in them. So that's the origin of the name Blackland. I think there's supposed to be a suspected Roman temple at Blackland. But anyway, I want to talk about the landscape in the area. What was the landscape like in the Roman period? Well, I think the answer is heavily farmed. Sort of people ask me whether the landscape was much more heavily wooded in the Roman period. Well, of course, there was more extensive woodland in the Roman period, than there is now. But it wasn't a sort of wild wood, as some people might think. It was actually heavily farmed, both particularly in the Clay Vale where we are here. And this is very visible a few miles north at the village of Tockenham. And Tockenham is known for for Time Team viewers with Mick Aston. It was one of the very first Time Team episodes back in the 1990s, and here's quite a youthful Mick Aston with Tony Robinson by Tockenham Parish Church, and they excavated the Roman villa here. And they were drawn to Tockenham in the first place by the fact that there's a Roman statue built into the parish church tower here. I think it's reckoned to be Aesculapius. Here's the snake around the staff of Aesculapius. So that's what drew archaeologists to Tockenham in the first place. But in the 3-day excavation of Time Team and then the further work by Wessex Archaeology, they revealed that the villa is orientated, you can see here, it's orientated northwest-southeast. And actually the villa is built on the same orientation as all the field boundaries in the parish. I hope you can see that Tockenham Parish has this grain across it. The landscape is orientated northwest-southeast. So we've got all the trackways and all the parish boundaries along this line here, and then the crossways coming across. So it makes a pattern of square or rectangular small fields. And it's pretty clear that actually this is a Romano-British field system. It could even be Iron Age origin. These type of sort of wavy brickwork fields are well known across England and ascribed to the Iron Age or the Roman period. So it seems that the basic grain of the landscape was in place by the time that the villa was built, also facing northwest. But if you actually zoom out from Tockenham, it's not just the parish of Tockenham that's on this alignment. Here's Tockenham here, but can you see stretching east of Tockenham, all the way past Clifford and Broadtown, going towards Swindon and Wootton Bassett. You've got the whole landscape is on this northwest-southeast alignment, and you can see clearly here a parish of Broadtown, and these long tracks, parallel tracks. Of course, this is the Downs here. The chalk escarpment is here, and you're going up onto the chalk downs, and you've got these what must have been droveways for taking cattle and sheep up and down from the summer pastures up on the hills back down into the vale. But these are at least prehistoric or Roman in date. And I hope you can also see you've got this very long trackway here that respects the same alignment. It goes at 90 degrees to it. But to my knowledge, no one has ever really noticed this trackway before. I should say that a lot of the parish boundaries actually follow this trackway. So that the fact that the parish boundaries follow this trackway means that it's an ancient feature. It's at least Anglo-Saxon in date, and presumably earlier. And nobody's really noticed or talked about this before. But if you look at it on a map, it basically heads straight for the Roman town of Duro-Cornovium, which is at Wanborough. It's underneath the suburb of Swindon, basically. So the small town heads right for a Roman small town. So I do wonder whether this is in fact a Roman road that hasn't been really noticed before. And as I say, I haven't seen any literature on the subject, and it's something I intend to research further. But if you project it, you see here it's heading straight for that small town, and it could in theory go all the way to Bath the other end, although the course gets rather lost. But it could conceivably go through Bremhill Parish, the northern side of Bremhill Parish. It might just clip. So if anyone knows of any evidence in support of my theory that there might have been a Roman road somewhere in the vicinity, I'd be grateful to hear it. Here's the Tockenham villa that we were looking at earlier. This road could curve round and go to Sandy Lane, but I think it is. The modern A4 today actually does leave Bath on the sort of same general alignment over here in the west. I said I'd mention about Cunetio, the Roman small town at Minor, and that is interesting because of these very astonishing circuit of late Roman walls, which are almost unique in Roman Britain. And we have some good dating evidence for them. Coins discovered. Basically, the foundations for these walls sit upon a coin or coins that are dated to AD 360. So we know that the walls must have been constructed after AD 360. So these are late 4th or even early 5th century fortifications. And of course, looking at this, you would think, well, this is surely a response to the sort of ending of Roman Britain, the sort of raiding Picts and Saxon raids that are supposed to have happened in the late 4th and early 5th century. And of course, so these walls have been interpreted up until very recently as a wholly military response to the sort of increasing threat to the Roman Empire. But actually, an academic from Cambridge University, James Gerard, has actually suggested that actually it could be more a reflection of civic pride, and just as a castle might have or a town might have an impressive circuit of walls to impress visitors, that's maybe what you're seeing here. And there is some evidence to support that, and because you see this south frontage here is much more thickly built with more impressive sort of turrets effectively built onto the front, whereas the back is much less impressively built. So it seems to have a front and a back. And just as people in a posh house might spend a lot of money on the facade, and actually round the back of the house it is a lot less posh, because nobody's going to see it, that might be what's happening here. Here is the front that people will see and be impressed by, but if they went round the back, they might see that it's a little bit less impressive at the back. So there is a possible support for that idea that it's more about a flourishing life in late 4th century Wiltshire, rather than a response to threat and the ending of the collapse of Roman Britain. It could be an indicator that actually things were going quite well for farmers in Wiltshire, and certainly in Gloucestershire Cotswolds. We know that a lot of villas were still being built and mosaics being built well into the early 5th century on the Cotswolds. Another way of looking at the 5th century and the 6th century, this sort of transition period between Roman Britain and Anglo-Saxon England, is looking at place names, and particularly the Saxon names that include elements, words borrowed directly from Latin. And these include famously, well, Chester, which is the second element in Cirencester, and Gloucester, Gloucester. The Cester bit or Chester bit comes from Old English Chiaster, but that's borrowed from Latin castra, meaning a settlement or a fortification or a camp or something like that. But there are others. There's Eccles, borrowed from Latin ecclesia, church. Camp, borrowed from Latin campus, meaning a field. There's one in Gloucestershire, Camden, as in Chipping Camden. There's one, yes, this Funta one, Old English Funta is borrowed from Latin fontana, a font or a spring, a fountain. That's where we get the word fountain from. And we have a number of fonts in Wiltshire, mainly in South Wiltshire. So we've got Urchfont and Tefont, places like Fovant as well, places like that. And then also Wickham. It was Margaret Gelling, the place name scholar, who realised that if you plot all the names with this Wickham compound, Wick, Old English Wick, comes from Latin vicus or vicus, meaning a small settlement. And if you plot the Wickham place names on a map, they're nearly all very close to Roman roads and even Roman road junctions, and they seem to indicate Roman settlements. So it seems that the Saxons were borrowing this word Wick into Old English to denote some sort of Roman settlement. But the Chester ones, as well as occurring in place names like Cirencester and Gloucester, they're also in field names, and I did a study of the Chester field names of Wiltshire, and there's a very important one at Wilcott near Pewsey, a field called Stanchester, the stony Roman settlement, and sure enough there's a Roman villa in it. But the interesting thing is that there's also a coin hoard that came from the very same field, and it had this impressive gold coin in it that was minted in Italy in AD 405 to 6. So to get from Italy to Britain, it's got to have been later than that, and the coins might have remained in use for some years before they were buried in the ground. So it can't have got into a Wiltshire field before about 410, 415, 420 AD at the earliest. So you're talking well into the 5th century. So it seems that activity was going on in this Wiltshire field well into the 5th century, and that's presumably why it has this name Chester, because it's commemorating a Roman settlement that was still being lived in, and so the Saxons who saw it gave it the name because they recognised it was a Roman settlement that was still being lived in. That's my suggestion anyway. And then the Fonta, the place names, I mentioned Tefont, so it means something like spring on the boundary. But I suggested when I did the work that this is based on, it was my PhD basically, getting on for 20 years ago, and when I did my PhD I suggested that Tefont, the spring, was some sort of Romanised spring or Roman well, rather like this one at the Roman villa at Chedworth in Gloucestershire, where you've got a spring with a sort of stone pavement around it. So it's been Romanised as part of the Roman villa or a well cult. It's associated with a goddess as well, because the Romans had water goddesses as well. And then the Tefont Archaeology Project was set up, and sure enough, I'm very pleased to say that in the last decade or so, they've uncovered very good evidence for archaeological evidence for a Roman temple at Tefont, based around the spring, with some sort of Romanised well along the lines that I suggested. So I'm very pleased that archaeology seems to have proved my theory right, at Tefont at least. Then moving forward a bit in time into the sort of 5th and 6th and 7th centuries, the point I want to make next is that Bremhill was very much on the frontier of Anglo-Saxon England for almost 300 years, from about AD 400 up until 700, and well into the 7th century. Bremhill was right sort of on the front line of Anglo-Saxon England, where Anglo-Saxon England to the east met sort of post-Roman British Britain to the west. So in other words, the people west of here were still living a sort of semi-post-Roman British life without the trappings of Anglo-Saxon England. So they didn't have Anglo-Saxon style houses, they didn't use Anglo-Saxon style clothing or jewellery, and they didn't have Anglo-Saxon style cemeteries. They still had a different material culture that they were using to the west. So that they shared more in common with the people of Wales and Cornwall than they did to the people of Kent, for example, right up until the 7th century. And so we can see that in terms of language. So there's definitely greater concentration of place names from the Celtic languages in the north and the west of Wiltshire, with a particular concentration around the Malmesbury region. Yes, there are a few in the south and east, but not as many. So basically this reinforces the divide between the chalk and the cheese. Wiltshire is often known as the county of chalk and cheese. So this is the chalk bit, and then the cheese, the sort of low-lying clay vale of the Bristol Avon River that we have. So this is, it seems that the cheese part of Wiltshire is the British part of Wiltshire, and the chalk was Anglo-Saxon from an early date. And this is shown in this distribution of Anglo-Saxon cemeteries and burials. You can clearly see that the early Anglo-Saxon burials with swords and spears and buckles and brooches, they're all in the chalk area of Wiltshire, the south and the east. With the exception, they're also an area around Swindon as well, in the Thames Valley. There's also early Anglo-Saxon burials. But as soon as you get down off the chalk into the vale, there's nothing. There's nothing of Anglo-Saxon date being found really. up before the 8th century at least in this part of Wiltshire. So this reinforces the divide. And then the politics as well. I think what this all suggests is that whereas Anglo-Saxon political influence was strong in the south and the east of Wiltshire, this was part of Anglo-Saxon England from a very early date, this northwest part of Wiltshire probably remained some sort of British kingdom with its own British kings right into the 7th century. And it's possible that these British kings were based in or around Malmesbury, or possibly Bath as well, but I think the evidence is strong for Malmesbury. And the place name Malmesbury is particularly interesting. The Bury bit means an enclosure, and I'll talk about berries briefly at the end. But it's the first bit, the Malm bit, actually comes from a personal name, Mailduf. Mailduf, apparently that's how you pronounce it, because it's Old Irish. It's an Irish personal name, and so you think, well, what's an Irish personal name doing in Wiltshire? But then you think, well, actually, the Irish at this time were Christian, and some of the early Irish saints were some of the most forward-thinking in terms of the Celtic Christianity that was going on at this time. So I think that this British kingdom here had strong links with the Irish Celtic Christian world, the Atlantic world to the west. It had stronger links to the west than to the east. There's places in Somerset as well that have strong links with Irish saints. So it's part of this westward-looking world. And then there were a series of battles in the mid-7th century. So like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle talks of the Battle of Bradford, Battle of Avon in 652. We've got other battles going on at Cirencester. And so it seems that the conquest of sort of Somerset and South Gloucestershire happened from about 650 onwards. And then so this British kingdom falls and was incorporated into Wessex. And actually we get this name of a sub-king of Wessex, a man called Baldred, who apparently was operating around Malmesbury. So it seems that this British kingdom fell, and then this sort of puppet king called Baldred was put in to govern the area on behalf of Wessex. But then this was also a period where not only Wessex was expanding, but also Mercia, the kingdom of Mercia to the north, was also expanding at this time. And this British kingdom was basically in the middle, in the no man's land between the two kingdoms. Both kingdoms, Wessex wanted to expand north, and Mercia wanted to expand south. And so this power vacuum that was created by the fall of this British kingdom basically led to a period of strife and war between Wessex and Mercia, and Bremhill was right on the front line again. So poor old Bremhill was on the frontier of a war zone between Wessex and Mercia. And I think modern scholars now think that the Wansdyke, this enigmatic Saxon earthwork which passes not too far away from Bremhill, people used to think of this as dating from the 5th century, right at the end of the Roman period, whereas now we tend to think of it more in the context of this war that was going on between Wessex and Mercia around about 680 or 700, probably in the reign of King Ina of Wessex. So actually it's more likely that Wansdyke was created as a sort of frontier of Wessex against Mercia in this battle, this series of series of battles around 700. Actually, you see you've got the Battle of Woden's Barrow, which is directly on Wansdyke, recorded in 715 according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And that series, that war was basically ended when Wessex took the land, the whole of North Wiltshire, and so the River Thames became the boundary, not only between Wiltshire and Gloucestershire, as it is today, but also between Wessex and Mercia. So that's how the River Thames became the boundary between the two counties and the two kingdoms. But also another important point about the Middle Saxon period, the sort of 7th century on, is that this is when the Anglo-Saxons became Christian and started founding churches. So kings of Mercia and Wessex were busy establishing churches and also manors and in large estates at this date. So Wiltshire was divided up into a series of what I tend to call great estates, large royal estates, and these are detectable partly through place names. Place names tell us about where the central places were and which were the satellite settlements around these central places. So places like Easton and Sutton, the East Village or the East Farm and the South Farm, you ask yourself, well, what's Sutton south of? And the answer is the Saxon estate centre where the church and the royal manor was. So you get directional place names, but you also get names telling you about the status of the people who lived in these satellites. So you get places like Walton, the slave settlement, Charlton, the settlement of the free farmers, the middle class, effectively, the Saxon middle class. And this is where Charlcut comes in, because Charlcut in Bremhill means the cottages of the churls, these free farmers, the sort of middle classes. So I think that the place name Charlcut is one of these satellite settlements of a Middle Saxon estate, royal estate. And then you've also got functional place names telling you about farming. So the cattle farm, the Hardwick, or the sheep farm. You've got Cowick as well, the cow farm, and you've got Berwick, the grain farm, the barley farm. And also another way of reconstructing these Saxon estates is by looking at the geography of what are known as hundreds. The county was divided up into units called hundreds right up until the 19th century, and it's clear that many of these hundreds were based upon these Anglo-Saxon estates, royal estates. And so basically Bremhill is poised right between the two, the Chippenham and the Calne royal estates. We know that Chippenham was an important royal estate because King Alfred the Great famously stayed at Chippenham before the Battle of Eddington in 878. So there's good documentary evidence, and also Calne, there's good documentary evidence for that being a royal estate centre too. But the hundreds of Calne and Chippenham more or less coincide roughly with the estates. And so you see that Bremhill seems to have more affinity to the Chippenham estate than the Calne estate, although lands did change from one to the other. You can see here the Calne estate has this little outlier called Berwick Bassett, and the place name Berwick, as I've just said, is one of these barley farm satellite names. So the place name Berwick itself is telling you that it's an outlying satellite estate of Calne. You've also got Calne Stoke. A Stoke place name also indicates a satellite settlement, and it has been suggested that Coldstone, Wellington, the Coldstone name could be the Calne East Tun, the East Farm belonging to Calne. So could be one of these directional place names, the Eastern of Calne. And then you've also got Cowage here, which actually is the Cowick, the dairy farm. So there's lots of these sort of the place names are telling you that these were satellites of the Calne estate. Then as to the estate centres themselves, well, both Calne and Chippenham seem to have had these early churches right next door to what must have been royal manor houses here in the Middle Saxon period. And again, place names tell us about this. In Calne, you've got the name Kingsbury Street, and Kingsbury literally means the king's enclosure, the king's manorial enclosure. A berry is an enclosure that goes around a manor house and or a church. Just like at Wilton, you've also got the Kingsbury Square here, and actually in the street plan today, you can trace this enclosure here very clearly from the street plan of Wilton even today. And at Chippenham, you've got this strange name Imbury, which apparently in Old English means around the berry, around the enclosure, and that comes out as Emery. So the modern street name Emery in Chippenham is actually this Saxon word meaning around the burh, around the enclosure, the king's royal enclosure. So in the Middle Saxon period, it was these kings building these enclosures, But then in the later Saxon period, kings started granting out their lands and estates to aristocrats, or thanes, nobles, we call them thanes. So thanes started building their own manor houses and churches and their own enclosures around them. And you can see this process going on in Codford St Peter in South Wiltshire. Here you've got the place name Bury. You see the Bury and Bury Farm. Well, where is the Bury? We know that Bury means enclosure. Where is the Bury? Well, I hope you can see that Codford St Peter Church actually sits within this this enclosure, which you can still trace today, and actually you can still walk away all the way around it. There are public footpaths all the way around this enclosure. And you can see this lane here, there's a dog leg specifically to go round this Anglo-Saxon enclosure. And Codford St Peter is also famous for the Codford St Peter Anglo-Saxon cross shaft, dating from around about 800. So we've also got architectural evidence that something important Anglo-Saxon was going on in Codford in the 9th century. So we've got the two coming together. And here at Saintbury in Gloucestershire, you can actually see the Bury. The Bury here is preserved in earthworks. We don't have to imagine it, it's actually there, written in the ground. Well, that leads me on, that's my final slide, because what I'm trying to say, what I'm leading up to, is that I think that's exactly what's going on in Bremhill. We don't, to my knowledge, have a Bury place name. We don't have the Bury, just like we do in Codford. But that's fine. Not all the villages where I think these enclosures have Bury place names. Goring in Oxfordshire I've worked on, and I hope you can see that here you've got the church. There's a church here, and you see you've got the remains of this sort of oval enclosure, and then the village is tacked on to this Anglo-Saxon enclosure. And can you see the similarity between the plans, the village plans of Bremhill and Goring? I think they're pretty striking. I think what you've got in both cases is an Anglo-Saxon manorial church enclosure. You've got the manor house and church next to each other in Goring, and you've got this sort of oval enclosure, and then you've got a medieval village tacked on, and maybe even this sort of triangular village green, just like literally outside the door here, we've got a little triangle green with a cross on it. That's an obvious sort of marketplace or place for fairs and markets going on. So I think that's what's going on at Bremhill. I think we've got a late Saxon thane building a church and a manor house within the enclosure. And of course, Bremhill, it's already been said, there's Anglo-Saxon masonry in the church tower here at Bremhill. And then I think the thane grants the land to Malmesbury Abbey sometime before 1066. So thank you very much. I think I've used up my half an hour. I don't know if there's any time for questions.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam. Fascinating talk. I'm sure there are some questions. Elliot.
Can you go back to Minor?
Right, yes.
No, don't interrupt.
Oh, okay.
Are those Roman walls, to a certain extent, do they still exist?
I've never been there, to my shame.
Then you
So
won't
I
be able
don't-
to answer the next
no,
question. Where is the church? Is it within those walls?
Oh heck.
Don't worry.
Yes, does anyone know whether the parish church of Minor was inside the enclosure or
No,
not?
it's not at all.
No.
It's quite a way away. The Roman found it down by the river, near the
Okay.
bridge, and the church is
Right.
one way to the
Okay.
west.
Great.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I was just wondering about, the northwest and southeast, the way that it goes northwest.
The orientation.
Does it continue all the way down to the coast, on the south coast, in the same vein?
No, I don't think it does. But I mean, this grain of landscape is quite a common one. I mean, even if you go to Essex and Kent, you very often get the same northwest, southeast alignment. That alignment is quite a common one.
Any ideas why?
I think it's partly to do with transhumance and basically droveways leading cattle and sheep from the lowlands up onto the downs. And so, wherever you've got the escarpment, and I think, Broadtown, the escarpment is sort of broadly going on that diagonal, and so you've got the droveways directly at sort of 90 degrees to the escarpment. So the droveways go directly up the escarpment, and so that dictates the orientation. Yeah, so I think it's to do with prehistoric, moving of sheep up and down on a seasonal basis, farming.
Any other questions? I've got one. You've tantalised us with this idea that we might have a Roman road going across the top of it, so people will be dashing out now.
Yes.
What should we look for? What might be some of the indicators of?
It would be nice to find field names or some place name evidence containing the word Strat, just like Stratton and Stratford. Stratton St Margaret near Swindon literally means the tun, the farm on the Strat, on the Roman road. So the word stret or street or strat in Old English means Roman road. So if you have Stratfords or Strattons or something like that.
A Hare strata.
Well, yes, Hare. Yes, now Hare Street. Yes. Hare means army. Hare in Old English, Anglo-Saxon, the word Hare. As in the Mitchell Hare, the great army that Alfred the Great fought against. So Hare Street means in Old English the army street. So in theory it's a road that has some sort of military use or military association in the Anglo-Saxon period. But I think that
heads to Malmesbury, doesn't it?
Yeah, so that's not the Roman road. That's another thing.
Right. Okay. So place names. Any other things we might look out for? Any field? Any indicators in fields?
Yes, alignments of field boundaries and trackways. Yes, on that alignment.
Right.
Yeah, sort of on straight stretches of trackway or field boundaries. And also now we have LiDAR data as well, which I haven't looked at yet. But this LiDAR, when you can actually sort of see what's been below the ground and also what's underneath the tree cover. So you can actually see beneath the tree canopy of woodland and see what's sort of the undulations of the ground underneath it. So it would be worth looking at the LiDAR data.
We did a little bit with the archaeology field group, looking at the top of the hill in Foxham, and found some evidence of Roman activity there, some waste, but no construction. That was one of the things that unfortunately got waylaid in the pandemic problem. But it's an area we'd like to have another look at, because that would be in the vicinity of where your fugitive road might be.
Yes. Okay. Well, I look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Do you think the old railway line could be?
I don't know. Yes, I don't know enough about the local geography.
I don't know why it was put the way it was. Probably the straightest route between two places. Any other questions? Right. We're going to break for some tea and coffee, and so if you can sort of not all rush at the same time to the counter back, and we will reconvene in about sort of 15-20 minutes. Thank you very much.
That was really interesting. Yeah, I come from Hampshire, which is littered with Roman roads and everything. And I know the history, a bit like this one, the bar area. And I'm going to look up the field maps, just the strap. It might well be, because we go from, it's right at the side of the sermon, or something called the bit I'm in is yeah.
Yes, the Roman road is a famous tree.
Well, I think it might be that. That's where I live. Well, I live half a mile away from here. But I've done so much digging. We had to bury a big area of electricity thing. We've done deep. And I was in that trench. It's a simple thing.
Yes, it's just been doing it. This level where we live,
Yes, and the tef bit means spring on the bank. Yes, and the tef bit is a Celtic word as well.
Yes,
So the question is, what considered the boundary of that?
to give people have the idea that was something there.
Yes, there'd been some coins, I think.
Oh, I see.
Yes, and there were some skeletons already known from there. So there were certain indicators that something was going on there. And they've actually proved it and taken the buildings. Yes.
Never tried it with HDMI in here. No, I don't want to use HDMI because the sound problem. I use a lot of sound. And HDMI won't use the sound I want. Right. Straight away, he's used the converter. Yeah, that's VGA.
Well,
most people don't use the VGA because the speaker just unplug it and plug mine in.
Supplements related to this stuff. So it could be that in the late 70s we operated as some sort of minor with dependent campaigns. It is striking that Bremhill is unusually large as a parish, and a large parish of it.
Is it okay to cross that?
So I would really like that.
What will happen if you turn my sound recording? It's not going to cause you problems. Happy unplugging it.
It's the same word. It is an Anglo-Saxon word. I think it's so common in Scotland through various Scots. But it's not the same word. It's the word. And it's interesting because we tend to have and then building foundation.
Thank you.
One way to make an impact. I think the work
Yeah.